Just heads up, the first like 3.5 minutes of this is me explaining how I came to the ranking for this, like how I came up with where every show goes, and some other little housekeeping bits. So if you just want to get straight to the ranking, I'm gonna leave it in the timestamp thing, so you can just skip it straight to that. But yeah, enjoy. So this is the beginning of hopefully weekly Star Trek videos. I'm hoping to get these out on Thursdays. I know this one's going to be going up a day late, but starting from next week, hopefully this will be the beginning of like every Thursday there'll be a new Star Trek video, if the schedule remains the same. This is also my first Star Trek video since Discovery ended back in April. So I'm actually currently up to date with Lower Decks, and I just finished Prodigy season 2. So I thought it would be cool and fun to, for the first video to get back into Star Trek stuff would be to rank all 12 official Star Trek shows or series. Now, if you're confusing what the 12th series is, I'm counting Short Treks as its own separate show. Because certain streaming services kind of have it as like a separate thing. Like if you type in Star Trek and you get all the shows, Short Treks is like its own separate show. Whereas I think when it first came out, it was just counted under like Star Trek Discovery specials, and then with season 2, when they started having like a Star Trek Picard special, some stuff tying into Stranger Worlds, they were like, okay, its own show. So 12th show is Star Trek Short Treks. Now look, Star Trek fans are very opinionated. Everyone has their own favorite show, or the show that they consider the definitive, iconic, most important Trek series, and that all other shows that aren't in that spot don't count. I've only really been making Star Trek videos since this year, and I've learned pretty quickly that Star Trek fans are not afraid to tell you when they think that your opinion is hot trash and terrible and the worst thing they've ever heard, and lots of other colorful language. So let's remember that whatever my ranking is, it doesn't tamper with your ranking. It doesn't disqualify your ranking. That this is all just opinions from one guy that loves Star Trek and loves all the shows, loves all the movies. So let's remember that when we're commenting on this. But also make sure to let me know how you would order all 12 of the shows, or how many of the shows you've seen. Like, how would you rank every Star Trek show you've seen? Because I'm genuinely curious how different my ranking is to lots of people, or how similar my ranking is to lots of people. Like, am I actually quite similar to most people, or am I actually quite different? I want to know that. So let me know. Also, I guess to give you an idea of how I came about with this ranking, I'm autistic. The reason I'm mentioning that is because I am like really specific in how I organize TV shows and movies that I watch. So I use percentages and data to give me what I believe to be my definitive ranking of like everything I watch, which is a lot and it's stressful, but I rate individual episodes on a scale of 1 to 5, and then I use the ratings from the individual episodes to give me my final rating on the season. So like I'll give each episode a 1 to 5 star rating, then I'll add those all up at the end to give me like my definitive rating for the season as a whole. So I've organized this ranking based off of that. And after because I did a rewatch of the franchise really recently, I watched all of the shows and all of the movies from like late 2022 until early this year. So it was like a year and a half it took me to watch everything again. But that was, with work in college and everything alongside it. So it's a lot. And having to do this to get my definitive rankings is always a burden and a curse. But anyway, let's get into it. In 12th place, I have the short-lived and often overlooked 1970s Star Trek The Animated Series. Now, I barely see anyone ever talk about this show, so I'm not entirely sure if I'm playing with fire here by placing it this low. I don't know if some people are going to break into my house over this and be like, Star Trek The Animated Series is the greatest thing ever, what are you doing? But I've seen this series twice. So a lot less than I've seen most of the like original stuff. Like out of the original 6 shows, animated series is easily the one I've seen the least. I watched it for the first time in, I want to say, 2017-ish. I remember being really sick and the Arvus crossover Invasion had just come out. And I was watching that and I was super hyped over it. And then I was like, okay. Then I watched it for the second time last year during my big Star Trek rewatch. And both times I've just been like, yeah, it's got a charm to it. But both times I found it kind of strange. And I don't know, the 70s jank, I know it might work for a lot of people. Doesn't really work for me. I know it's product of its time and all that, but I've never really been into animation from that era. I don't know. It's interesting. There are certain elements from it that have become regular parts of like Star Trek lore, like Star Trek Lower Decks references it all the time. But yeah, animated series, it's not for me. But I would say that this is the only Star Trek series on this list that I downright don't enjoy. I think I get something out of every other show, whereas the animated series, some episodes are stronger than others, but overall, not a show that I am super crazy to revisit. In 11th place, I have the first show to usher in this new era of Star Trek, and that is Star Trek Discovery. Yeah, look, I know this show does have its fan base, but there is a loud and vocal part of Star Trek that insists that this show is terrible. You go to places like Twitter, that there is a lot of love for this show, but yeah, I know that Star Trek fans are extremely opinionated on if Discovery is a valid Star Trek show or not. But Discovery is a weird one for me because it's like, I really, really, really respect how every season of the show goes a long way towards reinventing itself. Like season 1 is so different from season 2. Season 2 is so different from season 3. It just goes like that, so on and so forth for all of the show's 5-season run. It feels like they're not afraid to really shake things up every season, and it also has introduced a lot of elements and things that I think truly add a lot to Star Trek as a whole. But honestly, I've never really come out of a season or even an episode of Discovery being like, oh, this is some of my favorite Star Trek I've ever seen. Like, there is a huge, huge, huge divide between what my favorite episode of Star Trek Discovery would be and then what my favorite episode of, like, Deep Space Nine or Strange New Worlds or Enterprise or really any of the other shows would be. Like, Discovery has really cool ideas, but I feel like the execution has almost always been where this show stumbles. Like, for every great moment in an episode, there'll be another moment where the dialogue just makes you go, is that really the best you've got? And it's just frustrating because I do think that it has the elements and it has the cast and it has the characters to have been a really great show and to be one of the best things in the franchise if it really tried to be. And then also, it did reinvent Star Trek for this new era. Like, sure, Discovery might not have been the best way to start it, but I do appreciate that it gave us some really cool things, and I'm going to talk about later on in this ranking. But things that I'm like, wow, like we probably wouldn't have gotten this if Star Trek Discovery wasn't as successful as it was, which it was pretty successful when it first started. But yeah, like despite having the cast, the characters to be a really great show, it rarely managed to actually do that. And also, I didn't mind the final season that came out this year. I know that the show was essentially soft cancelled. They were just given extra time to film something, but I do think the final season was not the best that Discovery has had to offer. Like I think season 4, for example, that was a much stronger season than season 5. So I would have liked it to go out a bit stronger than it did as well, but hey. In 10th place, I have Star Trek Short Treks, and look, I feel really bad putting this above Star Trek Discovery. I genuinely do, but I was looking back at like the individual shorts that Short Treks put out, and I just think on a regular basis, Short Treks was putting out things more interesting and more enjoyable than what Discovery would on a regular basis. So it's like, if you're looking at just the straight up percentage of how good Short Treks was and how good Discovery was, I think Short Treks as a whole put out stronger things more often. And it feels weird saying that because so much of Short Treks is directly connected to Star Trek Discovery. Like Calypso, Ephraim and Dot, all the shorts that were setting up Strange New Worlds, I think they were all great. Ephraim and Dot and Calypso are hands down some of my favorite stuff to come out of the new era of Star Trek. Like some of my favorite stories to come out of the new era of Star Trek. I think they are both really cool things and really strong. But I think they're just fantastic. And part of me is also a little sad that Discovery never connected to Calypso properly, despite constantly teasing that it might. And I also feel like them getting sent to the future was so they could eventually connect to Calypso. Whatever. Also, in case anyone in the comments is going to mention Very Short Treks as being its own separate show, it's like 5 YouTube shorts. They're like 3 minutes roughly each. Just assume that Very Short Treks is included in this, is in where Short Treks places. So it's Very Short Treks and Short Treks I'm counting as like the same show. I actually liked Very Short Treks more than most. I thought it was interesting that they tied into as much as they did kind of, and like they got it as many characters in as they did. I don't know, it was a cool little animated series homage, even if I don't like the animated series that much. And also the final episode has this really stupid song with like Riker, Sulu, and Tendi from Lower Decks, and it's the catchiest thing ever.
Put love on your duty roster.
So in 9th place, I have Star Trek Picard, and oh my god, I could not be more conflicted on this show and on placing it here because, okay, Season 3 is fan service. It's made to pander to people who love the Next Generation cast, and I loved every single second of it. I started my entire Star Trek rewatch because of the Picard season 3 announcement, where they were like, everyone from the next gen cast is coming back. This is going to be the big season, the final season, where it's going to connect to everything. And then we started hearing about how they were going to connect to some Voyager stuff and to some Deep Space Nine stuff. And I was like, okay, it's been years since I've watched next gen DS9 and Voyager. I need to rewatch them before this season comes out. And I started my entire rewatch because of that. And I only finally got to watch season 3 in February because I was keeping it as like the last thing on my rewatch. So I think I got to watch Strange New Worlds season 2, Lower Decks season 4, Discovery I was caught up on already, and then Picard season 3 as like the things I didn't get to watch because they came out during my rewatch. And I watched all of them together pretty much. And Picard season 3 is hands down the most enjoyable new TV I've watched this year easily. I had such a good time. It still felt like one of the next generation films, but with better quality, a little bit of a bigger budget, and it was just so enjoyable. Like, I binged the whole thing over one day, and it was just me smiling and giggling and pointing at the screen the entire time during it. Like, it was fan service, but it was done well, and I was being pandered to, and I want Star Trek Legacy with Seven of Nine and Jack Crusher and Q and Raffi and Terry Matalas back. Like, I want it. But I know since it came out, a lot of people have kind of talked about how the season is cool and fun, but that on a deeper writing level, there isn't much there in comparison to the first two seasons. And like, the season as a whole doesn't really have much to say. But I don't know. I genuinely was very, very happy with season 3. Like, for me, I watched it at a time where I really needed something like this, where it was just fun, enjoyable Star Trek that felt really fun to watch. And I feel like my memory of it is always going to be very high up because of that. But then it's weird because, like, season 2 of Picard, to me, is legitimately the worst season of Star Trek. I don't know how other people feel on season 2, but I think season 2 of Star Trek Picard is hands down the worst season of Star Trek. In like I don't know exactly how many seasons there are now. It's like 51, 52 seasons of Star Trek so far. And I think Picard season 2 is the worst season, like, of all of them. And then behind the scenes, they had to deal with COVID. A lot of writing stuff had to change. So because of that, season 2 is set on Earth in 2024, so that they don't have to have many people on set at once and that they can shoot outside and stuff like that. But for me, season 2 feels like a mildly generic, futuristic sci-fi, where it's like, I don't know, it's like, it feels like an original property that is not Star Trek related. It feels like a show you'd see on like Amazon or something like that, where it's supposed to be set in modern day but slightly futuristic. And it kind of feels as well like kind of like the flashbacks in The Expanse or the flashbacks in The 100 to show what their modern days were like. And this isn't a knock on those shows. I love The Expanse. I love The 100. It reminds me of it in a way where it's like, there's nothing in Star Trek Picard season 2 that feels like it's Star Trek enough. It feels like you could just change some names and put it in the Expanse universe and not a lot would change. You could change some names, put it in the 100 universe and not a lot would change. And that's a very bad thing. Now, I don't think season 1 is as bad in that department as season 2, but I think season 1 is very mediocre. To me, it's just a bland season that sometimes will do something cool, but it's like, Picard as a whole might be the clear winner in the most inconsistent series in Star Trek history, because season 3 would probably rank pretty high. If I was to do a full ranking of every single Star Trek season right now, Star Trek Picard season 3 would be very high up there. But then both seasons 1 and 2 are like very much on the bottom. Like, I can't think of how much more a Star Trek season has given me enjoyment than Picard season 3. Then on the flip side, I can't remember being as bored with a Star Trek season as I was with seasons 1 and 2. So it's like, putting it in 9th place feels far too generous for how I feel about seasons 1 and 2. But then putting it in 9th place feels far too harsh with how I feel about season 3. I don't know, I feel weird about it. I'm curious to see how other people feel about Star Trek Picard. In 8th place, I have Star Trek Lower Decks, and I do expect some people to want this show to be much higher on the list. But I mean, Lower Decks doesn't have a bad season, in my opinion. Like, I think it's a very, very, very consistent show. Like, season to season, I think the quality remains very solid, and we're currently over halfway through the 5th season, and I'm really enjoying it. The show almost always gets me with a couple laughs every episode. The core characters are all great, like Boimler, Mariner, Tendi, Rutherford. They're all so good. The show also sometimes just gets extremely heartfelt. Like, sometimes it'll tie back to something or have a character or moment just show up, or something with Boimler and Mariner, and I'm like, that's so wholesome, or that's so well done. There's also just an insane wealth of references and deep cuts to parts of Star Trek, and it also somehow nails the 90s aesthetic in a lot of ways. Like it feels like it's just an animated version of some of those shows sometimes. But I think what ultimately puts Lower Decks this far down, despite how consistently solid the show is I rarely think the show will have me walk away from an episode going, oh, this is peak Star Trek. And like that's not a bad thing. The show is fun, it's enjoyable, it's light, and sometimes you need a show like Lower Decks to put on and enjoy an episode or two without much thought or put into it or whatever. But I mean, when doing a ranking like this, you've got to think about what is the best Star Trek for you. How some of the other shows on this list make me feel, unfortunately, means that Lower Decks being light and fun isn't always what I can't wait to see. But I'm going to miss Lower Decks. I am excited to see how these final 3 or 4 episodes play out. But yeah, Lower Decks, I think it's a really fun show, really solid. It's not what makes me really excited to see more Star Trek, if that makes sense. In 7th place is one that I think is potentially going to surprise and maybe anger people, but it's Star Trek Prodigy for me. And I think Prodigy is far and away the most underrated series in Star Trek history. I think Prodigy, throughout its 2 seasons, has excelled in so many ways. And it's weird because the show is a kids' show. It's the one Star Trek show on this list that is primarily made for kids, but somehow it just gets Star Trek. The cast of characters may at first seem like they're the generic sort of one-note children's animated show characters, but they all each really grow on you over the first season, and then like by the end you're actively rooting for them and you want these little guys to get into Starfleet Academy and stuff like that. But you know, the show brings back characters like Janeway and Chakotay and the Doctor and some other characters I'm not going to spoil, but they tell this story so well done. And like, this might be a hot take, I think Chakotay is more interesting in Star Trek Prodigy than he is in Star Trek Voyager. I don't know, that might be crazy to say, but if Picard is a proper sequel to Next Generation, Prodigy feels like it's a proper sequel to most of Voyager. And I feel like it routinely lives up to the promise. And the fact that it has 2 seasons of 20 episodes means it also has more than enough time to stray away from the main plot, to give you very Trek-like one-off episodes, and you know, where they focus on a phenomenon in space or a new species. And there are episodes that feel just as good as your stories from Next Gen or DS9. The show also has a great way of connecting to everything. Like, Lower Decks is great with the references, but more often than not, when Lower Decks makes a reference or a deep cut, it's probably because they're using it as a joke. Whereas when Prodigy does it, it'll make a reference or have a character show up and it's like, it's actually relevant to the plot, really important, and makes a lot of sense. And they make it so satisfying to watch play out. I don't know, if you haven't seen Prodigy, please check it out on Netflix so that we can hopefully get a season 3, because seasons 1 and 2 are so good. In 6th place, I have Star Trek Strange New Worlds, and this closes out the new Trek shows, or the new era started with Discovery in 2017. I love Strange New Worlds so much. I love both seasons, and I think both seasons so far have been the most... It feels like 90s era Star Trek, essentially, but with a budget and look and music of today's TV. I actually thought Strange New Worlds was fairly well liked among the fandom and the community, but I was kind of surprised when I started making videos earlier this year to see some people not super into Strange New Worlds as much as I thought. You know, some kind of arguing against me when I was saying like it felt like Star Trek, and they would kind of say back to me that no, it absolutely doesn't. And that kind of surprised me a little bit, because I don't know, the reviews for this show have always been the top of new Star Trek reviews, sort of things. Like, it seemed like this is the one show that was getting to a lot of people, but I guess not. But I don't know, I think Strange New World isn't just good modern Star Trek, but it's just good modern TV. Like, both seasons 1 and 2 were 2 of my favorite seasons of TV of their respective years. I think Anson Mount is a fantastic Captain Pike. The visuals on the show are stunning. The score for the show is some of the best in the franchise. The crew as a whole is really well built out, where each character can hold their own in an episode centered on them. I think in terms of the live action shows, this is where it really feels like 90s Trek to me, because the 90s shows, they were at their core ensemble shows. Like, we might go 3 or 4 episodes without Picard in a big role in Next Generation because we're focusing on Riker or Beverly or Troy. None of the newer shows have really done that besides Strange New Worlds, I feel like, where Pike might not be around in a big way for 2 episodes because we're focusing Strange New Worlds on La'an doing a time travel mission with Kirk. Then the episode after that might be about Spock and Nurse Chapel or something like that. You know, like, I think this is what really makes Strange New Worlds work. The biggest issue with the show, in my opinion, though, is that they take forever to make 10 episodes. We're looking at late 2025 before season 3 comes out, and it's already been a year and a half since season 2. Like, and that's just, guess, modern TV in a nutshell. The days of getting seasons every year is pretty much over, unless you're like The Bear or Slow Horses. Anyway, on to the top 5, and if you've been paying attention, the main 5 live action shows that were around before the new era have not been covered yet. So the 5 shows that a lot of people have a lot of big opinions on are about to be talked about. So let's be nice. In 5th place, I have Star Trek, also known as the original series. And I mean, this show is iconic. It's influential in ways that would take me days to list here. It's responsible for so much things in television history. I don't know how many times I've seen certain episodes of the show, like Mirror Mirror, City on the Edge of Forever, Balance of Terror, all episodes that are some of my favorite television of all time. And during my rewatch, which would have been like early 2023-ish for the original series, I was so impressed by how much of the majority of the show actually held up really well. Like most of seasons 1 and seasons 2 felt timeless. They hooked you in these episodes and they just didn't let you go for the 40-minute runtime. The trinity of Kirk, Spock, and McCoy is probably the most iconic trinity in the franchise still, and it's immediately obvious why when you're watching these episodes, why they are still considered the iconic Trek trio. Now, sometimes the show was a little less than stellar. Season 3, for example, isn't really close to the first 2 seasons, in my opinion, in terms of quality. I think Season 3 in general is one of the weaker Star Trek seasons as a whole, especially on an episode-to-episode basis. But just as a whole, the show is still one of the most progressive television shows of all time, based off of the kind of things it was putting out and putting onto screen in the 1960s. Like, it's crazy the sort of things that they did. Might not be my favorite Star Trek, but it's the most important for a lot of reasons. Not just the most important Star Trek, one of the most important television shows of all time. In 4th place, I have Star Trek The Next Generation, and this is a conflicting one because while maybe not the most important Star Trek show, I feel like Next Generation is probably the most iconic Star Trek show. I also feel like a lot of people's first Trek nowadays is likely to be Next Generation than the original 2. I know that there are going to be a lot of diehard Next Generation fans who are like, why is this not at least second, if not first on this list? But I think what gets me is that Next Generation is fantastic for 4 straight seasons. Once you hit the part of season 3 where you start getting like Deja Q, Yesterday's Enterprise, Sins of the Father, and The Offspring, all within like 7 or 6 episodes of each other, you've hit potentially the peakest period of Star Trek episodes of all time. And the Next Generation continually puts out episodes that are around this quality all the way up until mid-season 6, in my opinion. Like, late season 3 through season 5 are just phenomenal. And, like, best of both worlds. That's the most iconic television cliffhanger of all time. You can't tell me that Mr. Worf fire and the big music swelling up and then the to be continued is not the most iconic television cliffhanger of all time. It is. It's just...
Mr. Worf. Fire.
It's still fantastic. When I rewatched the show and I got to that episode and that whole thing came out, I was like, it's so good. But then, I don't know, I feel like seasons 1, 2, and 7, especially 1, feels so far off the mark in terms of quality. Like, people always talk about Star Trek shows having that curse of only getting good after like 2 or 3 seasons, but I personally think Next Generation is the only show to actually have that curse. I think season 1 is, I don't think it's a great season of TV. And I mean, it is obvious why. Next Generation season 1 is made up of either leftover scripts from the original series or script from the unmade series, phase 2 from the 70s. So Next Generation season 1 has this thing where it's like it comes out in the late 80s, but a lot of the scripts, a lot of the writing does feel like a late 1960s show or early 1970s show that's being made in almost the 1990s. Like, when Next Generation gets going, you'll be hard-pressed to find better Star Trek, but I just do think it takes a little too long to get going. And then also the fact that they knew they were going straight into movies after season 7 meant that a lot of season 7 doesn't feel like it's as much of a final season as you'd like. It feels like they can't get too interesting or too bold with some of their ideas when they were wrapping up the show. That said, though, All Good Things is one of the best TV finals of all time. It's so good. That final moment of them all playing poker and we pan up is just, It's so good.
Getting from there to here. It's been
In third place, I have Star Trek Enterprise, and I think this is probably one that is going to piss people off, but I am a hard Star Trek Enterprise truther. I think Enterprise was continually getting better. Like, I think it's the one Trek where every single season is better than the last, and every day I'm sort of thinking about how great it would have been to see season 5. Like, I'm so sad it got cancelled because it could have been something truly amazing by the time it reached its 7th season. But I think season 1 and the majority of season 2 are really solid TV. Nothing super special, but they're solid. And then around the midpoint of season 2, Enterprise starts putting out episodes and the quality goes up, and the quality just doesn't come down all the way through to the end. It just keeps ramping up and up and up, in my opinion. And I know everyone has their say on the series final. These are the Voyages. Hot take, with the context of knowing that These Are the Voyages was made as like a final to that era of Star Trek, considering that they thought that Enterprise was it. You know, Nemesis had flopped. Enterprise was the last sort of Trek on the horizon. They wrote that as not just the final for Enterprise, as a final for the franchise as a whole. I don't hate it with that context, but yeah, using the final episode of Enterprise as a weird tie-in to the Pegasus from 15 years prior, where it's super obvious that you're not on the actual next-gen sets and that people have aged. It's a choice. It's a weird choice. But with the context that it is the final for the franchise, what they thought at the time, I don't hate it as much as other people do. Although I really wanted to see Archer's speech about the beginning Federation. That would have been cool. Anyway, getting out the point here. Besides that, I think Enterprise just kind of manages to have this really strong balance of being cool and awesome, being dark and gritty, while still retaining the Star Trek stories and messages for the most part. And I know prequels are done to death. They're done in everything these days, even Star Trek. Like, it feels like 90% of the new Star Trek stuff we're getting is prequels to old stuff. But I kind of think Enterprise did the prequel aspect really well. Like, seeing Archer struggle with a lot of the early rules and not having any guidelines and having to decide what to do and what not to do, it was a fascinating struggle. And then when the show gets darker with the Xindi storyline, it still keeps a lot of this where it's like Archer and the Enterprise are forced to do some bad things while trying to save Earth. And it's always painted as like, while they're doing it to save Earth, it's not the morally right choice. I know, I think Enterprise kind of feels a little bit like Enterprise Season 3 feels like it learned from Voyager's mistakes in that regard, where Voyager was not allowed to be serialized. Voyager was not allowed to do a lot of the more interesting things with its conundrum and with its premise, whereas Enterprise kind of learned from that and actually tried to do that. And then you got Season 4 of Enterprise, which is legitimately some of the best Trek of all time, doing tons of these 2 or 3 episode arcs that tell so much backstory, and it's such an inspired choice. Like, I don't know, they knew it was the end, so they weren't making it to Season 5. They knew that, so they started just doing as much setup for later things as they could, which was really enjoyable to watch. In second place, I have Star Trek Voyager, and I know Voyager gets a lot of flack thrown its way, but I'm going to just say straight off that this is the one show on the list that I think is biased from me. Like, it was my first Star Trek, so I have a lot of nostalgia for it. I grew up watching Voyager on VHS tapes, and I had no interest in watching like Next Gen or DS9 or the original or Enterprise for years. Voyager was the only show I ever had any interest in. I've been to one Star Trek con ever, and it was the 2012 London XL, and I was like 14, and I was allowed meet one captain, and Kate Mulgrew was who I met because she was my captain. Voyager was my show. And I'll admit, during my rewatch, it was hard not to get frustrated with the show because the premise is so cool. And then knowing that throughout the entire show, they barely ever actually capitalize on their premise and are forced to hit the restart button at the end of most episodes. It's really annoying, especially when you see how Star Trek Enterprise Season 3 handled it, or even how Ronald D. Moore, after his experience in Voyager, went off to make Battlestar Galactica, like the reboot. Like, it shows how good Voyager could have been if they actually were allowed to be good. But I think the Voyager remains one of the Star Trek series completely in terms of its characters. While, yeah, the constant resetting isn't great, I think the characters are always easily the most interesting part of the show. As some people, like Chakotay, like Harry, don't get the sort of the I guess they don't get the number of episodes a lot of other characters get. But I don't know, Janeway, 7 and 9, the Doctor, these are all iconic, best of all time characters in the franchise, and I stand by the opinion also that Voyager pretty regularly had the best 2-parter episodes. Like, look, you can't beat Best of Both Worlds. That's the most iconic television cliffhanger of all time. But besides that, I think in general, Voyager would put out the craziest, most intense two-parters on a regular basis that left you dying to see what happened next. Like the kind of ones that would make you go, okay, I'm watching the next episode right now. I gotta see what happens next. I also did really appreciate the family aspect of Voyager. Like as the show went on, you get this feeling that these characters and this crew are actually becoming a family. And one of my small issues with Next Generation was how the crew of the Enterprise D always, they felt like it's different in the movies, it's different in Picard, but in Next Generation itself, it kind of feels like the characters mean not as much to each other, and that they're always a little mean to each other. Riker, for example, is always kind of a dick for no reason to people like Worf or Geordi in that show. And like these guys are friends at their core, but they still feel like they're friends because they're forced to work together. Whereas in Voyager, because of the premise of the show, you feel like these people truly deep down care and would do incredible things for each other. And I love that. I don't know though, I am expecting to be called out for Voyager being this high. Fight me, I don't care. And in first place is, of course, Star Trek Deep Space Nine. I mean, this is probably the one that I think a lot of people are going to agree with me on. Because Deep Space Nine isn't just the best Star Trek show, in my opinion, but it's the best science fiction series of all time. It's fantastic. Deep Space Nine is why I don't think the early seasons of Trek are bad complaint usually stands, because I think Deep Space Nine is a much stronger season 1 and season 2 than Next Generation or Voyager or Enterprise do. Emissary stands out so differently from like Encounter at Farpoint from the Next Generation or Caretaker from Voyager. Where on the show you have Enterprise, the Enterprise D always being the best of the best. It's always everything's so clean and new on that ship. Everything's shiny. Everyone's always constantly having intellectual conversations, and everyone's the most professional person in Starfleet all the time. And then you go to Deep Space Nine, where everything's broken and everyone's arguing all the time, and everyone has an agenda and a motivation, and everyone feels like a real person generally. There's this moment in season 6, for example, where like Bashir and O'Brien are in Quarks and they order food, and Bashir gets a steak and it arrives, and O'Brien just looks at it and goes, I should have gotten that. It's like, it adds nothing to the plot or the overall story of the episode. But it's such a real character moment that no other Star Trek show does. And I think that's why Deep Space Nine is the best. The characters don't feel like characters, they just feel like people who exist in this world. And you feel like you know everyone so well by the end of the show. Like you normally can tell how someone is going to react in any given situation because the writing is so strong that you understand these characters to perfection. But DS9 also just has this great way of picking up plot lines or stories or ideas the Next Generation leaves on the floor, and then Deep Space Nine will reuse them and do something with them that instantly makes how they were in Next Generation even better, because you know Deep Space Nine does great things with them. Like so much of Deep Space Nine is just picking up the pieces of an okay Next Generation story and then doing something incredible with it. Janeway might be my captain, but Sisko is the coolest in my opinion. And that is my personal ranking of where I would put all 12 Star Trek shows to date. The next show is currently supposed to be Starfleet Academy, so it might be fun to revisit this in a year or two to see where that new show places. This is probably going to be my first of many rankings related to Star Trek, so if you have ideas for videos or things you'd like to see on the channel, please let me know what your ranking for all the shows would be as well, and let me know any ideas. If you're new to the channel, make sure to subscribe. If you're not new, a like and a share usually helps a lot. Thanks so much for watching, and have an amazing day.